Good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Mayo. I am a professor of economics, business, and public policy at Georgetown University here in the McDonough School of Business. I am also the executive director of the Georgetown Center for Business and Public Policy, which is our host organization for today. We are today very excited about hosting an event on understanding governmental barriers to small business financing for people with criminal history, with a criminal history. Now, as excited as we are to be hosting today's event, I would be a little remiss if I didn't tell you that this event today is part of two larger work streams. The first is that there is a research center at Georgetown, the Georgetown Center for Business and Public Policy, whose mission it is to call attention to and amplify issues that lie at the nexus of business and public policy. We do that by engaging scholars both at Georgetown and around the world to write policy papers, to write short economic policy vignettes that are digestible to business people, to policymakers, to people outside of the university. So I encourage you to go to our website and check out the various things that we've written and to participate in future Georgetown on the Hill events like the one we're doing here today. The second thing I'd like to do is to let you know that this event is corollary, I'll say, to the Georgetown Pivot Program, which is a program that provides returning citizens with the business and entrepreneurial skills that they need to succeed in the modern workplace. Again, I would encourage you to take a look at the Pivot Program website, Georgetown Pivot Program. You'll find some very interesting things going on there. I also want to let you know that like all Georgetown on the Hill events, you are welcome. We value audience participation, so you're welcome to pitch in your questions, comments, suggestions. Those questions will be gathered up over the course of the event today by my colleague, Professor Pietro Rivoli. Professor Rivoli, I should say, is both a senior policy scholar in the Georgetown Center for Business and Public Policy, and she is the co-executive director of the Georgetown Pivot Program. So over the course of the panel discussion, she will monitor your questions and comment suggestions, and she'll make sure to get those to the panelists, and we'll hear from as many as possible. So please do feel free to engage. You'll just need to write your question or comment in the Q&A tab that appears at the bottom of your page. Now, finally, I want to turn to the event over to our moderator for today, Dr. Crystal Francis. Dr. Francis is the assistant program manager for the Pivot Program here at Georgetown. She has served as a senior program analyst for a number of years for the federal government, and she's been very active in justice reform and policy for over a decade. Dr. Francis has a bachelor's degree in criminal justice. She has a master's degree in Homeland Security and a PhD in public policy and administration. So without further ado, let me turn it over to you, Crystal.
Thank you so much, John. It is my privilege to be able to moderate today's discussion. I want to take an opportunity to introduce our panel of experts this afternoon. First, you will hear from Chris Pilkerton, who is the former acting administrator of the Small Business Administration and Chief Legal and Regulatory Strategy Officer for Accion Opportunity Fund, the largest nonprofit small business lender in the United States. You also hear from David Slussel, who is the Deputy Director of the Collateral Consequences Resource Center, which is a nonprofit organization that promotes public engagement on legal restriction and societal stigma for people with a criminal history. You'll hear from Sekwan Merritt, who is an entrepreneur and owner of Lighting Electric, a certified minority business enterprise in Baltimore. Merritt has a master electrician expertise, and he started his company immediately after returning home from prison in 2017. And then lastly, you'll hear from Awesta Sarkash, who is the Government Affairs Director of the Small Business Majority. She directs the nonprofit organization's policy and government affairs efforts for the nation's capital and the Mid-Atlantic region. So thank you so much for serving on our panel discussion today. And I am going to start with the first question, and I want to direct this to start off, Sekwan. If you can, from your perspective, describe the challenges that individuals with criminal histories experience when attempting to start or grow a business.
Afternoon. First, I would like to say thank you all for having me. Appreciate it. One of the main challenges I faced was obtaining working capital. It was really tough to, when you go where I'm going at and I want to be, a staple in commercial electrical contracting, when we enter into these commercial contracts, a lot of them are 30-day payments, or 60-day payments. So up until that time, we have to have money to pay for material. We have to have money to pay for, labor and payroll until that time. One of the biggest things with the SBA question last year in regards to the PPP loan is, are you currently on parole and probation? I am on parole and probation. I've been on parole for the last 4 years. However, that still does not discredit the fact that I am a business owner that employs formerly incarcerated in a lot of the underserved community. So it was, kind of tough that I wasn't able to get that, leg up to provide for my team, my employees, so they can, still have, access to provide for them and their families during the pandemic. That was pretty tough. I entered into the different portals. You can apply through different banks. I applied through my bank. Soon as I answered yes to that question, because of course I was not going to lie, the application completely ended. They took me to the last page and said, you no longer could go forward. And I did it on another bank, and it did the same thing as soon as I answered yes to that question. That was pretty tough. Someone like me, that, with the permission of God, has the grit to just keep going. I have to hustle and bustle back to, customers and, some of the people we serve that have a relationship with and ask them to expedite our payments because we don't have access to these SBA loans. We don't have access to certain lines of credit as other electrical contractors have because of, my background. Of course, we don't have credit and things like that established. Not only just people formerly incarcerated, but just minorities. This is a lot of us. We are first gen contractors. We're first gen developers. I mean, we just did not have that opportunity for my father and his father to be, even compete in this field. So, that's tough. And a lot of the things that we have that I've been learning has been self-taught and has to been just, getting on the ground and just really grinding to make things happen and having the type of customers and doing the work that we do, because we do perform, whereas though they will be willing to, give us access or expedite our payments so we can keep moving. But that's tough. And it's also sometimes embarrassing because other companies don't have to go through that. They don't have to, operate at a bottleneck where they have to worry about, is a payment going to come, 2 days or 3 days before payroll? It's not efficient, man. That's not effective. But, those are some of the things that we go through. That's the reason why, one of the reasons why I agreed to speak to this panel. Hopefully these things change, but it's pretty tough, man, because we had a lot of entrepreneurs I know that have just quit.
Thank you. Chris, same question. From your perspective, what are the challenges that you're seeing?
Sure. Thank you, Crystal, and thank you to Georgetown for having us here today. And Sekwan, thank you for sharing your experience and everything that you're doing to help folks, employ folks, because that's what this is all about. I started my career as a prosecutor in the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. So I've been involved in criminal justice for years. And back in 2019, when I served as the acting administrator at the SBA, I realized that, the economy was strong and unemployment numbers were low, but they weren't low for everyone. And every business that I went to, we need workers. And so one of the things that I wanted to do was look at underserved communities and say, where are people being left behind who can really provide, a lot of value, a lot of support, a lot of talent to these businesses. So at the SBA, we created a program where it was basically the opportunity to have large companies and smaller companies, small businesses get together with nonprofits in those communities and open up opportunities for a number of different folks, which included formerly incarcerated. It was one of those events where I actually met folks from the Pivot Program. And we were able at SBA to host a number of the Pivot Fellows to learn more about SBA programs and not just lending, but also support and technical assistance. And have continued to be in touch with the Pivot Program folks. The First Step Act was passed in 2018. And one of the key parts of the First Step Act was about the policy goal of reducing recidivism. And when you look at our country, where we have the highest number of incarcerated folks in the world, a huge percentage of that comes from underserved communities. So obviously, one way to help folks when they're coming out of prison is to get them jobs, right? But the barriers to getting into the job market are very high for folks coming out of prison. One, it's the fact that they've got a criminal record, right? And employers are obviously looking at that. There's also training issues. There's outdated equipment that they maybe get trained on in prison programs and what have you. So if you can't get a job, then the American way, well, let me start a business, right? Which, as a former head of the SBA, I couldn't support more. But as Sekwan was talking about, there are obviously hurdles there as well. And so I think, as I see this issue going forward, there really does need to be kind of a coordinated effort. And this is a very bipartisan issue. I've had conversations with Democrats and Republicans. First Step Act, very bipartisan bill, that this needs to be addressed, and there needs to be that level of transparency. And in some of the research that I've done on this issue, the programs that are in prisons can be so critical to helping folks, once they leave prison. There's a program in Texas, for example, that I saw that has 1,300 graduates, 100% employed within 90 days of release. 88% of those within a year in checkings and savings account, and a 380% reduction in recidivism. So when we look at these issues and you look at the larger policy goals, these are the things, as a country, but as a small business owner, we really need to be focused on. And once again, I stressed before, it's a bipartisan issue, and it needs to be, because this is such a huge population of our community. So with that, Crystal, I'll turn it back to you and look forward to the ongoing conversation.
David, from your perspective, what challenges are you seeing?
Thanks, Crystal. I want to talk about some of the governmental barriers that business owners face. Sekwan touched on some of them, both in the federal government and state governments. I came into this work last year during some of the fallout from the CARES Act. When the money was announced for small businesses, we started to get questions, excuse me, at our nonprofit, which works on criminal history barriers, about whether or not expunged and sealed records would have to be disclosed to get COVID-19 relief funds from the federal government. And I looked into it, started to write articles about what these policies might look like for the Paycheck Protection Program. Our servers crashed because we had so many people that were trying to figure out what were these barriers. And we kept writing about these policies and ended up being part of a coalition to help advocate to roll them back. Part of why it was so challenging and I was so shocked as someone who studies these barriers is I had never really seen criminal history barriers that were so broad and blunt, in the sense that people on probation or parole currently for any offense were excluded. There's a whole list of exclusions that included people with felony convictions for the past 5 years, but also someone who commenced parole or probation in the last 5 years, diversion, anyone with pending charges for any offense. So those restrictions were so broad. There was a recent study by Iran that found that Just one piece of those restrictions, the felony conviction 5-year look back, excluded at least 212,655 businesses. And the study found that 24% of those businesses had a Black owner, so it was a disproportionate racial impact. And it also affected 343,198 employees. That's just the felony conviction restriction. So that doesn't include all the other restrictions that I mentioned. So when you look at the effect of how that has affected small businesses, even when there was pushback from Congress, from the public, from the media, those changes took months to take place. And in the meantime, people had to meet payroll and their expenses. And even once the changes came through, there were a series of changes during the Trump administration. And then another one in the Biden administration, months down the line, and it's confusing for people to sort of figure out what the new policy is and how it affects them. So with that experience, we wanted to look at our organization more broadly at the barriers that the government puts in place for people who are looking to have capital support that's often guaranteed by the government in the case of the SBA. And the results are surprising. The SBA, which is a huge player in the small business financing world, last year, in fiscal year 20, they did over $750 billion in small business loans. Most of that was COVID-19 related, but even just the traditional programs, the 7A, the 504, and the microloans, there was $28.4 billion in loans. And when you look at those programs, the SBA has imposed criminal history restrictions. I've been looking at the history since at least 1958. And the statutes don't tell the SBA to have these restrictions. They decided that character is part of creditworthiness. And they started to impose these restrictions in 58, and they've gotten worse and worse in subsequent years. Throughout different administrations of different parties, a paper by Professor Tajania Henderson that was written in 2005 found that there's been no empirical evidence connecting criminal history and creditworthiness. And yet these policies persist. And if you go through each program, they vary, but they're often very confusing. They vary from the forms to the regulations. So the regulation may say people on parole and probation or people who are in prison are excluded. But if you look at the policy manuals, it becomes much broader. It includes people facing charges for any offense, people facing an order of protection. Often a felony conviction, no matter how old, 25, 30 years, can either be an absolute barrier or a barrier that requires a business owner to go through additional hurdles with the bank, where the bank will have to submit a special request to the SBA headquarters for the SBA to review their case. So anyway, as you can tell, I can talk a lot about some of the technicalities of these programs, but I just wanted to highlight a couple of effects of the programs. One is, it's been argued in Professor Henderson's article, for example, that these policies may violate the ECOA, a 1974 Civil Rights Act that protects against discrimination in lending because of the way they impact people with criminal records, which have a disparate racial impact. So that's one factor. The other is just, there's a broader recognition today of second chances and fair opportunities in society. And I think it, is time that the SBA might reevaluate some of these policies. When I've looked at the history of the regulations, there is not a clear justification that's been put forward. But I did find that in 1976, the SBA proposed that it might let people who have been on parole or probation for 2 years obtain a loan, but they decided against doing that. And I just want to quickly read the quote because I think it's instructive of where the agency has been and where things could change. The quote is, "Chief among the reasons for this decision is the agency's belief that SBA should not be involved in rehabilitation processes, that a finding of good character is essential in any credit transaction, and the risk of absentee management in the event of reincarceration is too great for the agency's responsibility to protect the taxpayers' funds." And that's from 1978, just 4 years after the ECOA was passed. And I think it reflects a thinking that's no longer the public policy consensus. And, it may be time to to revisit that rationale and to support entrepreneurs like Sekwan and the hundreds of thousands of others out in the community who are particularly not only supporting themselves and their family, but often other formerly incarcerated employees and other members of the community.
Thank you. Wessa, same question. We know that, starting businesses is the key economic driver and growth for this country. So what are you seeing in terms of challenges for people trying to start or grow a business?
Yeah, thank you, Crystal, and thanks to everyone at Georgetown for inviting us here and the rest of the panelists, particularly Sekwan, who I think can provide the most meaningful perspective here. I think for us, and this has sort of been reiterated by the other panelists, so I'll try not to be redundant, but access to capital is continuously the biggest barrier. I mean, we know that many individuals already struggle to access traditional financing, particularly people of color, women, and those in underserved communities. That challenge is very much exacerbated for justice-impacted individuals. For instance, we know that justice-impacted individuals tend to operate small and micro-sized businesses. David touched on this and Chris touched on this, and obviously Sekwan mentioned this as well, but after the first round of PPP dollars were approved, we saw that smaller and micro businesses were pretty much shut out of access to those dollars. And that was also true for women and people of color, who were 3 times more likely to get denied for a loan than their white business counterparts. This is, of course, there's always the option of SBA loans, but to David's point, there are a lot of parameters associated with those programs. For instance, if a small business owner meets the no credit elsewhere parameters, meaning that the applicant is, unable to obtain a loan on reasonable terms without a federal government guarantee, and that some or all of the loan isn't available from the resources of the applicant, they could be eligible for an SBA loan, but there's a ton of hoops that you have to sort of go through. Programs like 7A, while they've been helpful for some businesses, have historically not reached underserved businesses as successfully. We also know that even with the eligibility, there are tons of hoops that they have to jump through. And so when we think about access to capital, for a lot of to-be or current business owners with a record, there just aren't a ton of options that are accessible, responsible, and really fit their needs. In starting and growing a business, accessing mentoring, support, and technical assistance are just as critical as access to capital. But we've also seen that there's very little awareness about these programs in local communities. And this was mentioned before as well, but finding a job is a huge component to building out a business. Up to 60% of ex-offenders remain unemployed 1 year after their release, which is why we need to make sure that there are pathways to entrepreneurship for justice-impacted folks. Again, contracting also sort of comes to mind. The federal government doesn't give out contracts in some cases to companies who employ certain people with criminal records. And so you're sort of undermining the success of folks who want to change their trajectory. And you're also undermining the success of their employees, who in a lot of cases can be justice impacted individuals as well. And then finally, just day-to-day interactions sort of showcase the prejudice that justice impacted businesses face. We know that businesses are hesitant or can be hesitant to do business with folks who might have a criminal past. So to sort of wrap up all of this, to say that we know that starting and growing a business is a feat in and of itself, but significantly, it's much more daunting for justice impacted folks. We need to make sure that when we're addressing these issues, because when we do, we'll spur local and state economies and drive up entrepreneurship across the board.
Thank you so much. I want to touch a little bit on, take a little deeper dive on some of the restrictive policies. We know that the SBA did impose, broad criminal history restrictions for the COVID-19 relief, but we also know that the Trump and Biden administrations have rolled back some restrictions on the emergency relief. Sekwan, this question is for you in terms of the SBA Form 9 912, the statement of personal history, which is used to assess an applicant's character. Can you talk a little bit about, that form and, just applying for a loan in general, how some of the questions can pose barriers to just having access in general? Can you take a deeper dive into that form and your experience?
Yeah, so at times the questions alone, just let's think about the SBA just guarantee a loan on its face, on its surface. A lot of people think it's difficult to obtain SBA loans just before you even have a criminal background. So, excuse me, to be faced with the SBA Form 912, when it asks about your background, some people don't even go forward with even turning it in. Because even though it says it's not a disqualifying factor, it still can be. Excuse me. Just a couple more. It still can be in terms, be a disqualifying factor. And really at times, you don't even really want to fill the form out. So, excuse me, I have a cough coming. I don't know where it's coming from.
Okay. So while Sekwan is doing that, Chris, can you just, provide a little bit more insight on, we understand this form, it says that you answering the question is not going to prohibit the lending. And, there's lots of ban the box legislation that's out just on applications in general. Do you think that has any applicability here in terms of the 912 form and just lending in general? Should criminal history questions be asked on applications?
Well, I think, Crystal, to answer that question, at the end of the day, lending facilities, the SBA is a guarantor, right? Except for the disaster program, there's pending legislation on this, but the SBA doesn't hand out money itself. So the way it works at the SBA is these protocols are put in place. As David pointed out, there is guidance on that. And then the banks make the loans. And they make those loans, and assuming that they follow all of those steps, if the individual ends up defaulting on the loan, regardless of who the person is, then a certain percentage of that is essentially guaranteed by the SBA. And the bank has to come back and submit for that 70, 75%, whatever it is for the guarantee. So there needs, of course, be a process in place. But I think, what I would suggest here is that, it's got to be a data-driven process. David, I think, made some excellent points, as did Awesta, about this process and what works and what doesn't and who's impacted. And I think by looking at this entire criminal justice system, you need to have a couple of different things, to make this work and make it work consistently. You need transparency, right? People need to know, what they're up against, and they need to have some rational reason as to why that this is the case. And then you need to have coordination across the entire system. So I mentioned before about programs sort of back in prison. The reason it's relevant to your question is, these lending institutions need to have a determination that this person should have creditworthiness, right? And on its face, they need some independent analysis of that. So how can, I'll call it the system, support that so that formerly incarcerated folks who want to start businesses have, a better chance to make that case? Is it programs that they can start with back in prison that actually help support that? Are there programs that could be, from corporate activities? There's the development of something now called the R3 score, which really helps to speak to this exact issue. But at the end of the day, all of these things can only be supported by the data, and the policymakers, whether it be on the Hill or the folks that are running these agencies, need to be able to have access to that data. So once again, it's consistent and transparent. Because once you have those two things, then you can have an understanding as to why people are making these decisions, regardless of party. Once again, I come back to the idea that I do think this is a bipartisan issue because it's such a huge percentage, of folks that are being impacted by it, and reduction in recidivism and small business and that whole ecosystem is critically important, to the whole country, and will continue to be, particularly because, as Awesta pointed out, of the huge impact on underserved communities.
Yes, and before I move to David next on a follow-up question, in your opening statement, you talked about a successful program in Texas. One of the viewers would like to know, do you know the name of that successful program in Texas that you were referring to in your opening statement?
Right, I was reading about it. It's the Prisoners Entrepreneurship Program was what I had read about. But there's a number of these programs, and I would recommend that folks look at this. There's one actually, we're here in Georgetown in DC. There's a group called DC Central Kitchen, which basically brings folks together. I think it's on a 14-week program of training them on how to cook and provide various hospitality services. And I haven't seen the most recent numbers, but I think they have a 99% employment rate and then a 98% employment rate 1 year removed. So there's some tremendous nonprofits that are out there, but it's that key coordination because, if the government effectively coordinates with those nonprofits and the Bureau of Prisons, you can have an ecosystem that really reflects the things that we're talking about here today.
Thank you. So David, the question I have for you, when we're thinking about the broader set of governmental barriers, and access to capital for people with criminal histories, what additional lessons do you think can be drawn from the SBA's criminal history policies?
Thanks, Crystal. Well, one thing I wanted to speak to that other panelists mentioned, including Chris and Sekwan, is transparency. The Form 912 asks applicants to fill out lots of criminal history information, and it says that the records are not necessarily disqualifying, but actually the SBA has policy documents that are very dense and sort of hard to get through, multi-hundred pages, but it lays out exactly what a bank is supposed to do. It says if someone has pending charges, or they're on parole or probation or supervision, they're out. If someone has a criminal record, but it only discloses a non-conviction or a misdemeanor that's older than 6 months, the bank can proceed. But if it discloses a felony conviction, the bank has to go through an additional character review with the SBA. And then if the SBA denies the person, then they have 6 months to request a reconsideration, in which the agency will consider the passage of time and other factors. So the fact that all those steps are outlined but not really transparent and not clear, I think, is a really a deterrent to applying and succeeding in that process. I think another really important aspect of the SBA policies is not just how they affect the billions and dollars of funds that the SBA provides, and also just as an aside, which Awesta mentioned, a number of the contracting programs and training programs also have criminal history restrictions, which is, in my view, counterproductive, especially when they're supposed to particularly target underserved communities and individuals. But I wanted to mention the influence of the SBA policies on other agencies and on states, because the SBA has these multifaceted restrictions. And, we've been trying to understand how banks themselves deal with criminal history, and a number don't look at criminal history except when required by the SBA. And others do look at criminal history, but surely the SBA's role in looking at these records is influencing private banks in their decision and serving as a source of guidance. It appears the states also are influenced. A number of states have restrictions on their state business support loans. For example, California has a law that says any local agency can disqualify anyone with a felony conviction from a economic development loan. Louisiana has a pretty broad restriction on their state economic development corporation, basically excluding anyone with a conviction for any offense other than a misdemeanor traffic offense. So you see the way that the SBA policies are so broad and sweeping and influencing other agencies. There are smaller programs in other parts of the federal government, however, that don't have such restrictions. The USDA has numerous small business lending programs for rural businesses and agricultural outfits. And when you look at those programs, there's an equivalent program to the 7A program in the USDA that gave over $1 billion in loans in the last fiscal year, called the Business and Industry Loan Guarantees. And that program doesn't have these criminal history restrictions we're talking about. It allows the bank on an optional basis to conduct a character review, but doesn't provide any specifics. And so you can see there's a disparity there even between how the SBA, which typically serves urban, maybe suburban environments, and the USDA is treating criminal history. The USDA has certain criminal history barriers that apply across the board for these programs, like that are targeted. They include growing illegal substances on a farm could disqualify someone for 4 growing seasons, or defrauding the USDA, but they don't have these far-reaching policies that seem to really exclude people on such a broad basis. So I think, you know, the lack of transparency, the influence on other agencies, and then finally just the mindset. I brought out that quote before where the SBA doesn't want to be involved in the rehabilitation process. I think that mindset is at odds with a bipartisan consensus that the rehabilitation, the reintegration, and the success of people in our community, whether or not they've had a criminal history, is important for all of us. And I think that's really key for how to think about this issue. And sorry, just one last point, which is there's this great intersection between entrepreneurialism and employment. Not everyone who goes through an entrepreneurship program will start a business, but they may gain employment skills. And many of these programs are affecting employees just as much as the business owner. The SBA's restrictions apply to day-to-day managers. So if the day-to-day manager has a record, that could disqualify the owner who may not have a record. And the end result is that these policies trickle down to employees as well.
Thank you so much. Wesley, you talked a little bit about and highlighted the effect on business owners and just access to capital in general. Can you talk a little bit about what do you think is needed to kind of improve access for individuals that have criminal histories? And do you think that Congress has a role?
Well, I definitely think Congress has a role, and sort of in thinking about that, I think about the Truth in Lending Act. This is legislation that currently protects consumers from predatory lending. That has not yet been extended to small business loan products. And so something like this extension would help to ensure small business owners don't fall prey to predatory lending practices. That's really important because if we know that entrepreneurs who have criminal histories or records cannot access capital in the traditional ways, they're probably more subject or more vulnerable to predatory lending. And so trying to pass this, which is something that essentially only Congress can really do, is really critical for justice impacted folks. There are states where this has already been passed, but as of yet, this is not a national measure that has been passed. And so passing that extension to disclose, APR rates and other terms that might not be as clear or transparent is going to be really critical to sort of protecting small business owners in their search for capital. As I mentioned before, we need to think about expanding the reach of SBA loan programs. David touched on this and how they can be reassessed for those with criminal records. If we know that, criminal records is not explicitly connected to risk, we need to reassess how we underwrite loans and how we identify or assess risk altogether for entrepreneurs who might have criminal records. One big program that we have been working on and I think can sort of play a critical role in making sure capital gets out to justice impacted businesses is the State Small Business Credit Initiative. This is actually a program under the Treasury Department, and this past year got reauthorized for $10 billion, which is significantly more. This is sort of the second tranche. The program was originally a President Obama era program, and it was a $1 billion program. That go around this time, it's a $10 billion program. It was incredibly successful during the first round, and there's obviously way more dollars allocated to the program now. But there's a huge amount allocated to technical assistance for SSBCI. While that is still in the very, very early stages of implementation, I think it's important. An important part will be supervision of the program. Are these dollars not only being spent on technical assistance, but are these providers letting their communities know that the dollars exist and ensuring that everyone, like justice impacted businesses, are getting access to those dollars? Because we know, and I mentioned this before, that technical assistance programs in a lot of communities, a lot of small businesses don't know that these programs exist. They don't know that mentoring programs exist. And so if we're able to connect the technical assistance component to here's how you can get dollars from this lender who's participating in the SSBCI program, it'll be a really important component. Congress has also introduced legislation in the past that would better support, the issue at hand, including legislation called the Necessary Entrepreneurship Workshop, or the New Start Act, which would equip returning citizens with the tools needed to launch their own business. Also, Build Back Better. There are millions of dollars in that legislation in the small business title that would give money to incubators that help people who have been incarcerated. And so I think when we think about making sure small business owners are protected, who have, a record in their search for capital, or even being able to sort of find capital, Congress can probably play one of the most important roles.
Thank you. Chris, the next question is for you. You talked a lot about transparency and expansion of programs. Can you talk a little bit more about, how this translates from a policy perspective? And can SBA make these changes unilaterally, or does Congress need to really be involved?
Well, I think, having Congress involved can certainly help, right? I mean, Weston made reference to some recent legislation that's out there. There's also been, credit legislation that's out there examining how folks can get more credit through sort of the current system. But I think when I'm talking about not necessarily expanding, but I do think government, having served in government, doesn't necessarily always coordinate as well as it could, right? And when we talk about this issue, I think the government can be very intentional and clear, and that's where the transparency piece comes into play. But it's not just about, the lending piece of it, whether it's SBA or USDA, but I do come back to the Bureau of Prisons, right? Because I think that's a critical component to this. Obviously, the executive branch has the ability to make regulations and sort of go through this process, but there is a lot of things that can be done to coordinate informally, inside and outside of the prisons, as well as in the private sector. So, for example, there's a large organization called the Second Chance Business Coalition that was initiated. I believe JP Morgan was probably one of the bigger folks that kind of got this started, but Bank of America is a part of it. AT&T, General Motors, Verizon, Walmart, the list kind of goes on and on. And that's very focused on hiring, but I did mention lending institutions, right? So they have a role to be at the table here. And having that coordination, it's not necessarily expanding programs. It's about coordinating what's already there and, maybe adding things here or there, but articulating, what's the problem and how are we going to address it? At the end of the day, when you think about criminal justice from a high level perspective, people are concerned about public safety, right? People are concerned about how do we make the system work for everyone? Well, if you want to reduce recidivism, you've got to go back and say, all right, how are we going to get this person into a position where they're going to, kind of go beyond where they were, get a job, start a business, to Sekwan's point, employing formerly incarcerated people. I mean, that's just beautiful, right? I mean, Sekwan looked at, and I don't want to speak on Sekwan's behalf, I'd love to hear from him on it, but the fact that he's hiring formerly incarcerated people, he's giving people a chance, and not every employer is out there to do that. So, when you look at these large companies that command massive supply chains, they can lead by example, right? They can hire these companies and be part of it. And it's not a mandate, it's the right thing to do. And I think having those three groups together, government, corporate sector, and then obviously the nonprofits are there as part of it, can really make a huge, huge difference. So Crystal, when you ask me what's the policy is, let's just sit down, talk, and coordinate. Let's make this work. Let's get labor involved. Let's get education involved. Awesta talked about infrastructure. Let's get transportation involved, but it's got to be intentional and it's got to be coordinated.
Thanks, Chris. I just wanted to jump in quickly on the question too. I agree with Chris that there needs to be conversations between the industry and Congress, and I think they can have a big influence on how this policy plays out. Actually, our organization is trying to facilitate more conversations like this to bring this issue forward, and we're very open to bringing all types of parties to the table. In terms of actually changing the policies, I think it's important to note that really the SBA itself can change nearly all of these policies. I've painted a dire picture largely, but actually the SBA itself in 2015 decided to reduce the criminal history restrictions on microloans, which are loans of up to $50,000. And those loans have restrictions that only apply for someone who's currently incarcerated. Probation and parole is only disqualifying for a smaller list of offenses, so it's not as broad. And they don't have that follow-on character review that I talked about that apply to many of the other programs. So the SBA is capable of changing almost all of these policies. The statutes don't require these policies. Actually, the statute says that the SBA can conduct a background check and sort of leaves it as at that. There's also an old statute that disqualifies from disaster loans people with a felony in the last year related to a disaster or riot, although that's quite narrow. So, but I do think Congress, especially during the PPP, both members of both parties in the Senate and the House put forward legislation that would have forced the SBA's hand and reduced the restrictions. And ultimately the SBA followed suit and sort of acted according to what was in those bills. So I think congressional oversight and private industry and entrepreneurs and employees and small business groups and nonprofits should all be part of this conversation.
In regards to this, I'm back now. I think I'm feeling a little bit better. I agree with everything you said, Chris. Also with Awesta said, I think we need to also attack the assessment situation. How we assess who is eligible for these loans, even if we have to, go through the criminal background check. I don't think it should be something on the outset we should ask, but if it comes into it that it's a factor, like what I did while I was incarcerated, I had the opportunity to go to Goucher College. I was obtained upwards towards about 60 credits towards my bachelor's degree. I maintained a 3.7 GPA average. These are the different things that I don't think we're looking into when we look at a person formerly incarcerated. We're not gauging. We're just looking, have you been convicted in the last 5 years? Are you recently on parole and probation? And then leaving it at that. We need to go back a little deeper. And I think policy needs to focus on a better assessment tool. I heard you mention, Chris, the R3 score. And that R3 score is something particular that goes a little bit deeper to assess creditworthiness and more than just the surface of denying someone and saying no. One of the other things in Maryland they passed in 2016, there was a Justice Reinvestment Act. Inside of that Justice Reinvestment Act, they actually had something called the Rehabilitation Certificate. This certificate would allow people formerly incarcerated to not be denied certain professional licenses. Once you get the certificate, they cannot deny you based on your criminal history. This certificate allows you to go past that question. They will never be able to ask you that question again. I think we need to also look at something, maybe in unison with that, because obviously, I want to be clear, someone that has a criminal background, it may be a factor. You got some people that do some, heinous things, and it may play on if a person may be creditworthiness or worthy of a loan to go into business. But however, I think we need to look at the other things that they may add. with the permission of God, my company is approaching almost, $500,000 in sales this year. They didn't, no one gave us a leg up. I was just out grinding. I told everybody that, I was a master electrician. I was dead serious about, providing this service for people, providing it with a smile, doing great, awesome work, and making safety first when we do our electrical installations. And we were modernized, right? We made sure that we stayed up with the latest code, the latest safeties, and our installations were awesome. But nobody believed us, like, on the outset. I mean, they heard me and they spoke. And that's another thing I want to hint towards, Chris, what you said, being intentional. We don't want to be hope pushers. A lot of these programs that you have out here that says they claim to help entrepreneurs and things of that nature, some of them are just pushing hope. They push you hope, you take pictures and they get you going. They, clap hands, we take some photos, and hopefully you'll be an entrepreneur. We want to be intentional about showing a person or helping a person start their business. And that can start also behind the walls in prison. We need to have more programs that are not only focused on higher education in college, because at most prison, I would say 80%, it stops at your general equivalent diploma, your GED. It pretty much stops there. They don't give you a means or a better avenue to grow and to develop. And if a person formerly incarcerated, most of the barriers they're going to face is employment. Why are we not propping them up to maybe own their own business, right? I started my LLC second day out, right? I had a bunch of, limited liability company books. I taught myself business in prison. I went to the Maryland State Business Building, 7 questions. What's your business? What are you going to do? What's your address? Who's your resident agent? Learned what that was, and done. $185 that my family gave me, I had my LLC up and I was up and running. I got my tax code again for free. Went to the bank, opened up my business address. That gave me a sense of real hope, right? That gave me a sense of real hope. Some of these programs, they don't even do that. It's like, let's be for real about giving this man starting a company, or man or woman, starting a company and actually moving forward, and again, being intentional. Like Chris said, that hope allows people to go. But a lot of people don't realize today in these underserved and urban communities, they're hopeless. They do not believe that they are going to make it. And they constantly back in the cycle of recidivism of doing the same things, getting the same results. We gotta be real with this thing, man, to really help people out.
Crystal, if I can say one thing too, everyone sort of mentioned this. When we think about reassessing the policies, reassessing the programs, I also want us to think about reassessing why certain programs have more statutes and regulations in certain agencies versus others. I mean, we have to ask ourselves, why are there so many statutes, regulations, and so on for SBA programs that target certain communities, but not for other USDA programs? I think we know the answer to that, but sometimes calling it what it is, which is prejudice, is also an important thing to say, and sort of gets to my point of reassessing why it's so important. Reassessing why we need to look at the programs and understand why did we come to these conclusions, and reassess how we can make sure that they're not prejudiced moving forward.
Thank you so much. We have about 5 minutes here before we open up to general questions from the audience, but I have a couple of questions that I want to just highlight here. Sekwan, can you explain a little bit about the certificate you mentioned and name it again? One of our viewers would like to hear that again.
Okay, that was in 2016, Maryland passed something called the Justice Reinvestment Act. And that certificate is specifically called the Rehabilitation Certificate. Certificate of Rehabilitation. In 2016, that was passed. And if applying for it, just reading it directly, if granted, eligible individuals who have successfully completed supervision cannot be denied certain professional certifications and licensing solely on the basis of their criminal conviction. That was another thing that I had to get into. I had to go to the Maryland General Assembly to obtain my master electrician license. One has to have a master electrical license in order to conduct business in electrical contract in the state of Maryland. One of the questions that they ask is, have you ever been convicted of a felony? And when you say yes, you have to immediately stop the application and send your application process to the Maryland State Board of Electricians, where they can either deny you or allow you to move forward with even taking the exam. So, I had to go to the General Assembly and I, spoke with them and told them, my birds and what I wanted to do. And I was allowed to take the exam. And ultimately, on my first try, a 4-hour exam, over 120 questions, I passed and I obtained my master electrician license through a lot of studying. But these are the things that, again, are just barriers for us just moving forward. But that's what it's called, the Maryland Certificate of Rehabilitation. I think that can be expanded instead of just saying that that will no longer allow a person to be denied professional license. Maybe we could put on there that will no longer be a determining factor for a person obtaining a loan or SBA loan. I just think going at better assessment processes and digging a little deeper into a character of a person and definitely what did they accomplish while they were incarcerated needs to be part of the discussion.
And this is the final question before we open it up to the audience. And this is for anyone who can address this. Are there resources right now to help returning citizens navigate the SBA process? And if so, could you provide some insight around that? And if not, then do you think that is something that needs to be created?
I'll say that, and I've sort of touched on this before, that technical assistance providers and local communities are a really important and pivotal, relationship to have because they can help folks create a business plan. They basically offer a lot of wraparound services. And so for folks who are looking to grow and expand their business, making those relationships, also reaching out to CDFIs who provide, sometimes micro loans, but to specific communities as well. They have a lot of success with are great places to go and to think about. And then I'll just sort of say other sort of places to access capital include community banks. For folks who are interested in, IDing those technical assistance providers or finding some responsible lenders, we do have a website called venturize.org. Or you can just touch base with me. I'll put my email in the chat. And depending on what state you're in, particularly, we can connect you to those technical assistance providers who can guide you through how to build and expand your business.
Crystal, if I could follow up on that, and OESTA is so on top of all of these things, so I'll just add a little more to it. But I couldn't agree more with everything that you said and the work that her and her team have done. Just specifically, SBA has programs or nonprofits they work with, like SCORE, the SBDCs and the local communities. As you mentioned in the introduction, I work for a CDFI now, and as OESTA pointed out, Accion Opportunity Fund has technical assistance as well as loans, and you don't necessarily need to get a loan to take advantage of the technical assistance. So there are a lot of organizations out there that really kind of take you through the process of not just the SBA, but really, how to build out a business plan and ultimately build your business. And then the SBA also looks at, contracting opportunities as well. And David talked about that, but there's 68 district offices across the United States for SBA. Obviously, with the pandemic, the engagement's been a little different. There's also the Minority Business Development Agency based out of Commerce, which recent legislation just made that permanent. And they have dozens of centers throughout the US as well. So there's a lot of resources out there, but I think there's some online resources, which is critical to ultimately meet, the entrepreneurs where they are, because I'm sure a busy entrepreneur like Sekwan, sometimes it's difficult to find the time to walk down the street or, drive somewhere and be able to walk in those offices. So there is something on the SBA's platform called the Ascent platform, which kind of takes you through your journey and sort of where you are in the process. So the resources do exist, but that's part and parcel of what we were just talking about, of trying to coordinate those things and really meeting the entrepreneurs where they are.
Thank you so much. Sekwan, did you want to go ahead and?
Yes, there's a lot of resources that there, but Chris, I wanted, I guess, kind of brush you with that. Yes, as an entrepreneur, we are extremely busy. I mean, now I got, techs out in the field. I got questions I need answered, invoices that need to be put in. I'm doing all of that because, we're just not built out enough yet for me to hire that administrative arm. When it comes to contracting or just, I think a lot of businesses, period, but 85% of it is administrative. It's so much, it's so many bids, proposals. I get phone calls estimating I have to look at. And also I want to try to, I guess, share that with you, Westa, with the technical assistants. Some of them are just not built for construction and development, right? They just they don't get it. We don't have enough people that actually teach us, okay, you can go to your local procurement office online to set yourself up to start obtaining even just small bids, right? Just even maintenance, construction contracts. A lot of people don't even understand procurement. What is that? Every jurisdiction, every county within your state has one that you could sign up for. Again, me just had to be an autodidact and learn all of this on my own. And it just shouldn't be that way. So Chris, I think we just need to build that bridge. There are those, services out there, but we got to build that bridge to get to us.
Thank you so much. So we are at 1:03. This is going to conclude the moderated discussion. If you're able to stay on, the panel will be here. I'm going to invite you to ask any questions by using the chat feature. Awesta has posted her contact information in the chat, so please make sure that you copy that before you leave. But we will now ask you, if you are part of the audience and want to stay for an additional 15 minutes to ask a question, please utilize the chat function and you can address your question to a specific panel member, or we can open it up to anyone on the panel who would like to provide insight on your question. So please do that at this time. Use the Q&A function. All right. Okay, so we do have a couple of questions that are coming in. I will, let's see. All right, so here's the first question. This is coming from Toby to anyone on the panel who can address this. What percentage of the SBA microloans went into default that were awarded to people with criminal histories?
I can jump in. We don't know the answer. Hopefully the SBA has that information. I know that an organization has submitted a Freedom of Information Act request to find out. But as Chris mentioned, getting more data and understanding how to better serve this group is really important. So I think if the SBA could produce some of that data, it would be really helpful and would help us get more towards also what Sekwan was talking about, developing a more holistic approach to evaluating candidates.
Thank you so much. The next question is coming from Brad. What efforts do you think should be made to engage with the SBA to change its policies to be more narrowly tailored to comply with the federal fair lending laws?
So I can jump in there. So, obviously every citizen should have the right to engage, with their government. One good fortune that I have is, and I know Awesta and her team are involved as well, is the Bipartisan Policy Center has put together a task force with recommendations across all SBA programs to examine disaster and the SBIC and the contracting as well as lending. And so the opportunity to examine these, hear from experts, and then put together a report that ultimately will be provided to policymakers. And so with that, and I was very excited to be part of this conversation because I think it's been great. Everyone who's here right now would love to get them involved in that, at least as an expert to hear from, because quite honestly, this issue is so incredibly important. We all bring, our different perspectives on it. But there's nothing more powerful than hearing from folks like Sekwan, who've done some just incredible things. And Sekwan was kind enough to tell us about some of the things he did, behind the walls, and then built this incredible business. And folks who are looking at these things and making these recommendations need to hear that.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. I mean, I know someone mentioned this in the questions. It can be, I'm sure, a sense of embarrassment, maybe bringing your story forward sometimes. But a former boss of mine used to say the squeaky wheel gets the oil. And I feel like that's so true. I was also an intern on the Hill. And so I know when we get a lot of emails and calls about an issue, the rep or the senator has no choice but to follow up in some capacity or another, depending on how popular or how many questions or concerns that they're getting from their constituents. And so it doesn't sound like a fun thing to touch base with your representative and your senators, but it is really meaningful. If you can coordinate with organizations like ours or Accion, it makes a huge difference because we can help to uplift those stories, and we can also put you in front of those members of Congress who are literally writing the legislation to change some of these laws.
The next question is coming from Christopher. For returning citizens, the process of applying for an SBA loan can be very frustrating, intimidating, and as Sekwan says, embarrassing. Is there a group or organization that specifically provides support and assistance to returning citizens who are going through the loan application process?
I don't know. I'm sure there are nonprofits out there that focus on that as part of it. I know that there's, as we mentioned before, a number of nonprofits that focus generally on SBA processes. But I think, with the work that CCRC is doing and the coalition that they've been able to build and the conversations that I've had with David and Margaret, I think there are, some resources out there that we can identify and then circle back to Georgetown and pass that along.
Yeah. One of the resources that were really helpful to me was Baltimore Community Lending. They were the only ones that actually give me like a leg up when we had our first 6-figure contract that we were able to, satisfy complete performance. And they gave us the help that we needed. They also were in talks of me getting the growth loan because I have a slew of other contracts that are bigger, but they were able to assist me and help me. They actually also had the technical assistance that I was kind of looking for. I mean, I was still, I still had to keep it moving, have, a sense of tenacity with them because it's kind of long with it, but they did assist me here in Baltimore. I don't know if they have other models like that throughout the country.
Okay, Catherine says, another barrier to qualifying for loans is the failure to keep income and expense records and to file tax returns for reasons that include not knowing, realizing the importance of, willing, not having the money to spend on these. Do you have any feedback for how one can help improve, returning citizens' ability to, keep the necessary records that are needed that may be requested when applying for lending?
One of the things I use is QuickBooks. QuickBooks is the best thing. When you apply for the type of entity you do at your state board, as soon as you get your tax ID number, again, I opened up my account with $100. I went to, the bank, gave my tax ID number and said, I want to establish a business account with $100. But then I automatically uploaded everything into QuickBooks. So QuickBooks tracks all of my, records, all of the cash flow that comes either in or out of the business. And, that has been was helpful for me in the beginning until I got like a bookkeeper to actually manage it. But yeah, QuickBooks kind of gets a snapshot of everything. So if you have to go back and get some information, it'll all be there.
I wanted to mention too that actually I think there are a number of organizations, Chris mentioned one prison entrepreneurship project in Houston, Defy Ventures, and there's several other local organizations. There's even some state programs that are focusing more on the skill side and education. So people can look in their area to see if there are such organizations. The SBA has been giving grants to some of these groups, and I know the Build Back Better has a large amount of money to support this kind of technical assistance. So hopefully there is help out there.
All right, and we'll have time for this last question here. I hear that the SBA policy was implemented during the 50s, which seems to parallel the time for pushing desegregation and the Brown versus Board of Education. Could someone talk about the legislative history or the person sitting on the SBA board who made these policy decisions as it relates to criminal records back in the 50s?
I guess I can quickly speak to that since I mentioned it. It's hard to say. The record's pretty sparse. I might need new glasses looking closely at the documents from the 1950s recently. They made these rules first in 58 with no explanation. Then in 74, they gave this explanation retroactively that it was to, that if people on probation or parole violated their conditions and were sent back to custody, that they would have trouble repaying their loans, and that was a reason for these policies. But obviously they're much broader than that. So I think it's hard to say exactly why these policies were first adopted. I think a better question might be like, why have they gotten more restrictive over time? And I think we don't know the answer to that.
Thank you. Well, that's going to conclude the question and answer session. I want to invite each panel member to provide just some final words that you would like to relay today. We'll start with Sekwan.
I just hope that my story or the things that I went through will help everybody that's, I guess, in the room of policy making, you know, just come together with some type of solution. Also, and just, you know, just hopefully just relate back to the human factor that we, you know, people that are returning citizens, man, we're humans just like you. You know, we're a lot of us are just trying to come home and we're trying to figure it out. We know that sometimes a job just might not get it like me. You know, I want to be able to leave a legacy for, you know, my sons. I want to be able to do the same thing when, you know, when the pandemic hits. A lot of companies that has been expiring and moving, they were able to hire their kids. They were able to bring their kids back to the office and give them something with their business with, so they still had some type of security. And that's what a lot of us want to do. You know, some of us, you know, we're definitely, you know, remorseful for the crimes we committed and the things that we've done. But as, you know, law-abiding, taxpaying citizens, man, we just want to get a fair shot. And we want to have a, you know, a leg up also with hard work, and just be able to do what we need to do, man, and be able to mesh well and adjust and grow with society.
Thank you. Final words from Awessa.
Thanks, Crystal. Well, I'll just say that I think the last 20 months or so have sort of underscored how meaningful small businesses are to our local, state, and our national economy. We know hundreds of thousands of small businesses have closed over this time period, and it's had a huge impact on our country, employment, families, people leaving the workforce, and so on. And so in sort of thinking about that, we have to ask ourselves, why are we creating or maintaining barriers that help to spur entrepreneurship? If we know that justice impacted individuals are entrepreneurs and are successful at starting their businesses, despite all the barriers, we need to be able to create more pathways towards entrepreneurship for them because of how impactful they can be for their communities. And so I would just encourage folks who are on this call to continue coordinating with organizations, talking to your reps and your senators about your experience, and just continue pushing and keeping the conversation alive.
Final words from you also, Chris.
One of my favorite quotes is, "We're not put on this earth to see through one another, but to see one another through." And the topics that we're talking about here today are, it's the right thing to do. And it's also the right thing for the country. You know, when folks talk about underserved communities, when they talk about, you know, areas that have kind of been hit by crime, you know, you got to figure out a way to solve the problem. And you solve the problem by reducing recidivism. And you reduce recidivism by giving people training and opportunities for jobs and to be able to start their own businesses. So it's, you know, it's a difficult issue, right? When I talk about trying to coordinate all these programs in the private sector and the government and nonprofits, that is not, you know, it's easier said than done. But I think if we focus on coordinating in an intentional fashion, as Sekwan mentioned as well, but in a transparent way, that we can get there. And so I think it's critical for the country. It's a very, very important issue. And I'm so thankful to be able to share all that with you today.
David.
Thanks, everyone. I really resonate with that idea that this is the right thing to do. I also especially appreciate Sekwan being willing to talk about his experience, because I think people that don't have as much experience with this issue can really relate to someone's opportunity to go through this process and think about how we could restructure these programs to invest in ourselves and in our communities. I think this issue is incredibly bipartisan, and there is so much interest nationally and locally in working on this issue. So I'm really appreciative for everyone coming to the panel, and I think this is the start of more conversation on addressing this issue.
Well, everyone, on behalf of Georgetown University, I want to say thank you for attending this event. That will conclude today's discussion. I do wish you enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you.